This is Rugby Unity. I am David Pembroke, and it's my very great privilege and honour to welcome to the program the CEO of World Rugby, Mr. Alan Gilpin. Alan, welcome to Rugby Unity.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
Listen, there is so much for us to talk about, but I'd like to get to know people before we jump into the meat and potatoes of the conversations around how do we help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world. So what is the Alan Gilpin story?
Oh, I'll start with a really tough question. What is the Alan Gilpin story? Listen, I've been doing this for quite a while. Been in World Rugby for 12 years, which makes me kind of frighteningly institutionalised, I think.
But where were you born? Where were you raised? What's that side of the story?
That part of the story, so proper rugby country, so Gloucester and Gloucestershire. So grew up in what's now called the Cotswolds. They didn't have that lovely honey-coloured marketing term quite so much back in the 70s. So it was just rural Gloucestershire back then. But yeah, look, very much southwest rugby country, born and bred. So been around the game all my life, which is fantastic. Seen it firsthand, in lots of parts of the world, but certainly through my own experiences, what rugby does for people, and that's part of my story too. I was, believe it or not, a skinny, shy 11-year-old kid when I started playing rugby, and rugby gave me a lot of confidence in life and leadership qualities and skills. So I really believe in that part of the rugby story and the connection with communities and sort of positive social change. So school days all through, the same area in Gloucestershire, and then eventually reluctantly became a lawyer. To please my parents, but then discovered that just to sneakily catch them out, I could actually be a lawyer in something that I cared about. So joined a big sports management company and actually started working on Rugby World Cups. That's how I first started working with World Rugby back in 2001, believe it or not. So my first men's Rugby World Cup was the 2003 World Cup in Australia. So I'm coming full circle next year with men's Rugby World Cup 24 years later, which feels kind of cool on one level and makes me feel very old on another.
So did you play, or did you keep playing through university, and what position did you play?
I did. I was a 7. I was a kind of 7 in the Phil Waugh mould, I'd say, in the sense that I made up for lack of size with a bit of grunt. Nowhere near the quality of Phil, I'm sorry to say, but yeah, played all through again that part of the southwest of England, as you know, whether it's Gloucester, Bath, Exeter. Bristol, Plymouth is a real rugby heartland. So I went to university in Exeter. Actually, I stayed in the southwest of university, so played all my university days through there. Carried on playing afterwards. Carried on playing until I was 30, but then knee injuries got the better of me. And been.
Who was your club?
My club. Well, I played sort of what would now be Gloucester's academy. It was called Colts back in the day, as you probably remember, before they sort of clubs professionalised. And my club, for those who know that part of the world well at all, is the capital of the Cotswolds, a place called Cirencester. So I played my club rugby in Cirencester, and then Gloucester Academy, and then Exeter University, and then back into club rugby afterwards. So yeah, it's been a bit. I loved it, absolutely loved it. Played a bit of 7, as I say, and then a little bit of 15 because I was just about quick enough when the pack looked big and they didn't want to throw a very small 7 in. I got to go and stand at the back and get really cold.
So it's wonderful memories, wonderful times, I'm sure, wonderful friendships, and a great connection to the game. And was it that connection that made you think, can I make a career out of this? Is there somewhere that I can make a contribution? Was that part of your thinking when you moved from the law into rugby or World Rugby at the time, or whatever it was called back then?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I was really lucky, David. I was working for IMG, so a big sports management company, working on Rugby World Cup's commercial program back in 2003 and into the 2007 World Cup in France in those days. And so I was kind of transitioning from being the lawyer, the kind of contract negotiator on that, into the business side of it. And then I left actually before the World Cup in New Zealand and was working on London Olympics on a different project, which was, again, wonderful experience. And then in late 2013, agreed to join what was then the IRB, as you'll remember, International Rugby Board, became World Rugby actually as I joined in early 2014. under Brett Gosper's leadership, and never thought I'd work for an international federation. Never thought I'd work on the sort of broader sports side of the, and it was a great journey to that point. I had no reluctance actually in being involved with World Rugby and Rugby World Cup. So I joined actually in 2014 as the kind of managing director of men's and women's Rugby World Cups, because that was my background in the commercialisation and event delivery part of rugby, and I've loved it. I mean, Rugby World Cups, and I've done now 10 Rugby World Cups, six men's and 4 women's World Cups, have kind of defined my professional life, and actually defined a lot of my life more broadly than that, and travelled the world with it. And what a privilege, what an absolute honour to be involved in such a great sport that people are so connected with. And I think that's why I'm sure we'll talk about the ticket sales we're already seeing for Men's World Cup next year. But the fan base we have in rugby is so wonderful. And again, it's been a privilege to be part of something that over that 20 plus years now has grown every 4 years, grown cycle on cycle, allowed us to invest more and more in the game more broadly. And yeah, that passion for the game's definitely not running out for me. I'm not running dry of that. I might be running dry of a few things, but I'm not running dry on that.
Well, and certainly we come together for a conversation at the end of a weekend that has been described by some as perhaps the greatest weekend ever of the Guinness Six Nations rugby. As a rugby fan and as the boss of the game, as you watched the games over the weekend, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? How was it, affecting the way that you were thinking about, the decisions that you have to make around the game?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, you're right. What an incredible weekend of matches. And I think we've seen a lot of that. I mean, Super Rugby Pacific's off to a great start. Some great running rugby being played. And, we had this recent, as you know, Shape of the Game conference, as we call it, a couple of weeks ago in London, where we bring stakeholders from the game together. And I think it's the 5th iteration of those that we've done. Just started after COVID, and the general sense of that was when the game's at its best, when rugby's being played well, it's a fantastic entertainment product on the field. That's not to say we're complacent, and there's lots more work to do about spectator experience, fan experience, and making sure rugby is at its best as much of the time as possible. But I think this last weekend of Six Nations just goes to show that we've got that in spades. I mean, those 3 games, all very different games. The Scotland-France game in particular, I mean, what an incredible game of rugby. I think, you think back to the old 5 nations and the early years of the Six Nations sort of 25 years ago, the idea that up at Murrayfield, Scotland would win 50 points to 40 in a Six Nations game where literally end-to-end, free-running, try-scoring action. Fantastic. Brilliantly match officiated by one of your own, by Angus Gardner. Yes. I thought he had a fantastic game. And again, that shows when you've got 2 teams with fantastic attacking intent, talent all over the park, and match officials who want the game to flow and be played in that spirit. Huge entertainment for the crowd that were there, and obviously for the crowd that were there, the right result. And it sets the final part of the Six Nations up well. And I was actually back in Cirencester with some friends watching that game and the England game away in Rome in the pub, and honestly, it's amazing being in a pub with rugby fans who, because you're in England, are cheering for England, but by the last 10 minutes were thrilled to see Italy win and close it out, and the progress that Italy have made. So again, I think we're seeing some special times.
You make the point there about the match officiating, and I think on this week's episode of Rugby Unity, in my discussion this morning with Ewen McKenzie, we made that point that really all 3 games were as entertaining as they were because of the refereeing. I think this weekend we got it right. But in many weekends, we don't get it right, and there are still so many issues to be resolved around the officiating. What is World Rugby's thinking about the game and about building that consistency so we have more of the types of officiating we saw over the weekend rather than sort of the stop-start, the too much TMO, and really not as entertaining as we had at the weekend?
Yeah, it's a great point, David. I mean, look, it's so challenging, isn't it? Because we've got a sport where the match officiating plays maybe more than some other sports quite a big role in the way the game feels to fans and to players. And we had this constant debate over the years. It used to be a debate between sort of safety and spectacle. Let's make sure we're making the game as safe as possible for players to play at the elite level, but we want to preserve the spectacle, and lots of debate about that. And then we realised that actually that's not a trade-off. We want safety and spectacle, and they're not opposed. And now, in the last probably 2 years, we've been having the same debate within the game about accuracy versus flow. And coaches and players and fans quite rightly want match officiating to make the big decisions right, so that accuracy piece, particularly in the big moments. But everybody wants to see the game flowing and the ball in flow, as we would call it. So, and again, I think what we've realised in these debates is, again, that's not a trade-off. We want both. We want as much accuracy as possible, particularly in the big moments, and the ball in flow. And that's the conversation we're having with the match officiating group. And there are some brilliant individuals in that group. We're lucky, again, to be at a moment in time, I think, in the game where we've got some really high quality match officials across the men's and women's game at the top level. So how do we continue to build that philosophy? One part of that, I think, and again, we as a sport have made it very hard, I think, in the last little period for match officials, because we've had a lot of changes and tweaks to laws and law trials. And, you take someone like Angus, who had that fantastic game at the weekend. You might be refereeing in Super Rugby Pacific with one set of law trials, and then suddenly in the Six Nations refereeing slightly different set of law applications. So we've got to try and tidy that up. And there was some good focus on that in our recent Shape of the Game conversations. And we've got to make it, consistent and simple as possible for the match officials, and then trust them to apply those principles in the way they can. And I think that's what we're going to see delivering more consistently, that brilliant product we saw at the weekend. I've made this point, before. In a rugby match at the top level, we're asking a match official to make about 800 decisions in a game. Now, some of those are non-decisions, but 800 moments in the game where they are deciding to either make an intervention or not as the game flows. I mean, there are very few, if any, other sports that in a game that is that fast moving have that type of decision making. So that gives you a sense of the ask we're making on these brilliant match officials.
So one of the ideas that we've been floating at Rugby Unity around match officiating, and Eddie Jones makes the point that when the referees come together at Rugby World Cup, that's generally when you see that real consistency, when they're working as a group. And we do see in other sports like cricket that the referees are international referees and they make their way around the game. So they are just one particular group. So Eddie has raised the issue, and we've discussed and agreed that we think it would be a good idea to have a team of full-time professional referees who are aligned to World Rugby, not to their particular countries or elsewhere, and they work for World Rugby and they deliver for World Rugby those major matches. Could or would that, or is that a good idea in your view? In your view?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting idea. It's certainly one we've had some discussion around. The ICC do it, for example, as you know, in cricket, where they have their sort of group of elite match officials, and we've got that group of defined elite match officials. But our challenge, as you say, is that they go back into other competitions under the direction, if you like, of referee managers in other competitions with slightly different remits. So I think it's definitely something we've discussed a lot. Definitely something we'll continue to look at. We've currently got Mark Robinson, the recently former Chief Exec of New Zealand Rugby, doing a match officiating review for us, looking at that type of issue, consistency, game philosophy, the use of the television match official, and how we get that balance right as well. So Mark, with a working group across the game, with players' input, with match officials' input, with union input and competition input, is looking at that. I think we'll see some strong recommendations along the lines you're describing from that. And then Mark actually joins us as our sort of new Chief of Rugby in May. So we're delighted to have someone with Mark's experience from many different perspectives in the game coming into that space to sort of help that debate move forward.
So that particular working group and that series of recommendations, does that then go to the 53-member Rugby Council meeting in the middle of the year to make decisions about, what to accept or not to accept?
I mean, yes, in principle. I mean, how quickly that one moves and whether we get there by June will be interesting. We have, and this is, again, the Shape of the Game conference, as we call it, that we just had, which had about 150 odd people in attendance. We've got a number of different sort of working groups and rugby committees, if you like, that consider those things. So a men's high performance rugby committee, a women's high performance rugby committee. They're quite often debating the same things, but from a slightly different perspective. Obviously, different stages of development and professionalism in the men's and women's games, and then the sevens and the community game, slightly different again. So those debates all feed into a set of recommendations. The match officiating reviews happening alongside that. I mean, pleasingly, that recent set of discussions, I think, came to the conclusion that the game broadly is in good shape. We don't need to make fundamental law change or rule change, as we maybe have done in recent years to move the game forward. And again, that's not to be complacent, because we recognise exactly in the area we're talking about now in terms of match officiating, consistency, use of the TMO, how we present the product and get better and more consistent broadcast presentation, how we make sure at the international level match presentation in the stadiums are a little bit more consistent as well. So there's lots to do, but pleasingly not fundamental change, but match officiating definitely a focus. And again, we're in a position where we've got a brilliant group of match officials. So how do we get the best out of them at this moment in time, going into what will be a huge, obviously, moment for rugby with the Men's World Cup next year?
Now, this is an entirely unfair question to put to a CEO, but to ask just around the governance of the game and the role of the council. You know, we've just seen a large and a significant change in the governance of the RFU around the role of their particular council. Is it fit for purpose that we have a 53-member council making decisions around how the game is actually played, or is it time to become more agile and to give more responsibility to the executive and to the board to be able to crack on and make decisions in real time so as that we can be more agile and we're not waiting for 53 people to gather, twice a year in London to make decisions? Because to me, it seems that's really not going to serve us well into the future as our competitors take hold in lots of key markets and become more aggressive, looking for our fans and looking for our players and everybody else involved in the game.
Yeah, look, it's a fair question, a fair challenge. I think it's a balance, isn't it? I mean, we compare ourselves constantly as a sport, as every sport does, to our peers and our competitors, if you like. Obviously, in Australia, that's very much sports like AFL and NRL, or NFL and NBA in the US, Formula One as a kind of global circus that we talk about in the sevens context sometimes. And the challenge we have when we sort of hold ourselves up against that is they're mostly single jurisdiction, single league propositions. Yes, international in their kind of output, but able to make decisions with owners in a slightly different way. I mean, we're a federation of 134 different nations. Now, the reality is that there are 20 to 25 of those that are playing elite, international rugby, that we'll see 24 of them obviously at a Men's World Cup next year. We've expanded Women's World Cup to 16 nations now. So we've got to find a model that gives everybody in the game a voice, no matter where they are in that kind of membership structure, but not so much of a voice that we lose all of the agility and all of the speed of decision making, as you referred to. I think it's a fair challenge that rugby union has generally been slow moving in this space, and that has caused us problems in the past. I think in response to those challenges, we've evolved. Again, maybe not as quickly sometimes as we'd like, but council comes together and considers big issues. We've just last year passed a new strategic plan that will launch publicly very shortly, but actually that we're already effectively implementing. The strategic plan, hosts for men's and women's Rugby World Cups, and law change are really where council's decision making authority comes in. Most of what sits around that is delegated into our executive board, and then obviously into the organisation itself. And our executive board has evolved a lot in the last number of years, and maybe that's not that well known. In a board of 14 people, there are 7, including our chair. Obviously, the first Australian chair we've had, Brett Robinson, who I know you know well. Our chair's elected, but elected as an independent. 6 other elected board members, but then 7 people on the board who aren't elected. So you've got that balance of independence. We've got player representation on the board now in the last couple of years for the first time. So that as that board evolves and as we make sure that board is effective and fit for purpose, we're building trust with council to allow the board to move the game forward more. And we've got to look all the time at those decision-making structures, exactly for the point you make, David, which is our competitors in what is a very fast-moving attention economy. Our competitors are often moving a lot more quickly than we are.
Do you think you could do a better job of explaining all of that to rugby fans around the world? Because I think, I know I'm very interested and I follow this closely, but I would like more information about all of it so I can make judgments and decisions and form opinions about what's right and what's not right.
Yeah, again, great point, and we should. We spend a lot of time maybe understandably talking about the game and what we're doing in the game and the investment we're making and what that means in different parts of the world, and clearly about our big events like men's and women's Rugby World Cups and sevens in the Olympics. And we probably don't spend enough time explaining to rugby fans who actually are interested what those decision-making processes are like, and what does it feel like to be in those rooms when, again, as per a couple of weeks ago, laws are being debated. Really, as you can imagine, some big characters, as you know well, in those rooms, from the coaching and match officiating and union CEOs. There's no shortage of robust debate about what the game should be doing, and then trying to come out with a relatively unified approach and move forward together. So I think that's a great shout. Is we should be talking more about some of that and making as much of it public as possible, and we certainly can. There's nothing to hide in that.
Now, you mentioned the strategic plan, and if Eddie Jones was here, because he gives me a whack every 3 or 4 programs about it, because, and quite rightly, that it was agreed at the end of the Women's Rugby World Cup. There was a meeting and, lots of hands went up. I think it was unanimous support. And we are now in March, and the fans of the game globally still don't know what this strategic plan is. Why has there been such a delay?
Look, delay only because we want to make sure, it comes back to the previous question, making sure we're talking to fans, I think, in the right way. Delay because we developed last year a strategic plan that was quite facing into the game. So massive, again, as you can imagine, at times challenging sort of stakeholder engagement. So lots of different views. It's a very different view if you're playing your mostly community rugby in a regional association and you've got a tacit link to World Rugby versus the sort of top 20 or so nations that have got a very strong link to World Rugby. So that was a very lengthy 9-month-long process. As you say, got to last September, presented that to our council, having been through the board all year, and then got unanimous support for that, which was fantastic because it's a real unity behind the game. Now what we're doing and have been doing, and actually coming through this Shape of the Game conference was quite an important part of that. We're testing what the implementation of some of those strategic shifts will look like, and making sure, I think, that we've got our stakeholders on board, making sure when we talk about putting fans at the centre of our strategic plan that we know what we mean by that. So we've got our next set of board meetings next month in April, and after that, when we've kind of finally, I think, shown the board what some of those decisions look like in action over the next 3 to 5 years, then we can publicly launch that plan. But it's very simple. The vision has been a bit simplified for us, where we're talking about powering rugby, uniting the game, enriching lives. That's the kind of purpose of what we see. That comes back to, I said to you, my personal connection with the game. We know that we've got a game that absolutely can enrich lives in lots of communities around the world in different ways. We have to have a plan that unites the game and sees the game move forward more together. So there's a reframing a little bit of our purpose and our vision there. But really, in action, it's about how do we take the money that we generate from a Men's Rugby World Cup and invest that over a 4-year cycle. That's quite simply what World Rugby does. We make our money from Men's World Cup and we invest that. So even the wonderful Women's Rugby World Cup that we saw in England last year, and it was truly I think game-changing event for the women's game, that's a net investment for us because we choose it to be, because we want to invest in the women's game and drive standards and so on. So that we're working through every part of the strategic plan, what it looks like in implementation, and then we'll start to build that narrative in the next.
So when can I get him off my back? Can you give me a date?
I would say start of May is probably our target.
Start of May. Yeah. All right. Start of May. I'll hold you to that. I'll ring you up if it doesn't happen. Now,
hold us to it for sure.
Indeed, I will. Now, listen, you mentioned fans at the centre, and I think that's a great idea. And if you have a look at the structure of, say, the UEFA football league or association, whatever it's called in Europe, they actually have a representative of the fans on their board. Is it time for World Rugby to get fan representation on its board?
Interesting thought. I mean, I guess we have a little bit of that in one sense. We have a couple of people on our board who are either in other sports and very close to the fan experience, or who are in the broadcast industry and therefore very much every day, talking and looking at what fans want out of sports coverage in a broadcast sense. So we've got a lot of perspectives on that. We also, more than ever, as every organisation in the game does, we spend more time listening to fans, I think, than we ever have. We do a lot of fan polling. So through our social and digital audiences and channels, we've got a lot of different abilities and options and opportunities to talk directly to rugby fans that we didn't have maybe a few years ago. So that helps. So again, whether it's shape of the game, whether it's player welfare and safety, we're talking directly to fans about what they're seeing and feeling about those issues. And then ultimately, and again, we do this on a fairly frequent basis, we run fan forums. So we have third parties that work with us that are able, again, independent of us, to go out and get fan views and hold rugby up against other sports in that regard. Whether over time we translate that directly into someone in the decision making room, it would be interesting to consider. It's not something we've looked at this stage, but we certainly could in the future.
Because the big European football leagues have done it, haven't they? They've recognised these fan groups that have become quite powerful, really, in their influence over the game. And I just wonder whether or not that's a structure, because in the game at the moment, there's a thing called the United Rugby Fans, run by a gentleman by the name of Mark Philpott, who is looking to play that role in rugby. And he's a good guy, working hard to try to do that. So again, how might that type of structure work, do you think? How could that become part of the influencing around the way that the game is administered globally?
Well, look, it's about engaging those groups, isn't it? I mean, again, they're a great, you just described one, there are great fan forums out there.
Yeah.
Some of them very sort of focused on specific issues, and some of them much more broad, some of them probably quite national, domestic products focused in some parts of the world, and some of them more sort of internationally. So, it's with our members, with people like Rugby Australia, how do we engage with those groups, making sure that we're getting that feedback. So it's definitely a challenge for us to continue to evolve into, because we want to make sure rugby's thriving in all of its professional and domestic competitions around the world, and at a kind of cross-border level, and then obviously at an international level. So there's a lot of different views in some of those things, and that's fine too, because it's a global game and we want those different views. Styles of play, what fans want, are slightly different in different parts of the world. So yeah, it's a great challenge to face into for sure.
Yeah, but certainly recognising the fans in the strategic plan is going to be quite a powerful positioning element, I would imagine.
Yeah, and look, and people sometimes don't want us to talk about the product. We're talking about a wonderful game that's played, all over the world at a community level, and in a lot of places, obviously at an elite level. But ultimately, we are trying to have a great product that competes with other forms of sport and entertainment. We're competing for people's time, their attention, in terms of buying tickets and other things. That we're competing for their sort of share of wallet, and we've got to make sure, as you say, we're current. And the balance is always, how do you make sure you've got a game that the avid fans, and we've got some 400 million plus fans around the world who regularly consume rugby, and actually almost double that who would identify as followers when the big moments occur. So how do we make sure we keep those avid fans following the game, loving rugby, consuming more and more rugby, and we bring more people into that sort of broad church? And that's often the challenge, is having a product that attracts the casual fan in, whilst not alienating somebody who has followed the game for life, probably played the game, or was in a family that played the game. And that's part of the complexity and fun of what we do, I guess.
We're not talking rugby, We're building it. Rugby Unity.
So you mentioned in an earlier answer the appointment of Mark Robinson, the former CEO of New Zealand Rugby, to the head of rugby, which is a new position in World Rugby. Take me through your thinking as to why you felt it was necessary to bring in an experienced administrator like Mark Robinson into a role like that, and what can we expect, or what improvements can we expect by Mark taking on that particular remit?
Yeah, look, we're delighted to have, quite opportunistically, I guess, with the timing of Mark's departure from New Zealand Rugby to have secured, such a great talent in the game for the next stage of our journey going forward. And again, it comes back to that strategic plan. I think what we realised last year during the development of the strategic plan and looking again at how do we make sure that, yes, we're evolving as an organisation. We're an international federation, but we're also an events and media business across the properties that we own and commercialise and use to drive the game forward, those big iconic events. How do we make sure that the product is actually at the centre of that? And I think we realised that maybe we haven't done as much as we need to of placing the rugby piece right at the heart of World Rugby and how we're structured as an organisation. We've got some brilliant people working tirelessly in that space, led by a guy called Mark Harrington, who does an amazing job. But Mark's remit's enormous. I mean, player welfare and safety and the strides that we make in that space. And, we're world leading in a lot of that, with particularly instrumented mouth guards and the work we've done there, the research we do. Again, recognised by other sports as a leader. There's a huge attention there. There's a huge attention across the more dry but very important stuff like anti-doping, training education, all the pieces that make up our sort of services, if you like, to the game. But we want to make sure somebody is thinking all day, every day about just the product, and match officiating being a key part of that, as we've already discussed. So we recognise the need to do that. We used to have Joe Schmidt, as you might recall, in part of that role. Joe was with us for a period before he went back into coaching, was helping us again look at match officiating, look at how we try and shape the game so that it's the best it can be as often as possible. And then, we recognise probably that we don't want the game necessarily shaped purely by coaches. Coaches are paid to win, and that doesn't mean they're always thinking about what a fan might think about the game. We don't want the game purely shaped by match officials because, again, they've got a particular perspective. We don't even want the game purely shaped by players. We want the game shaped as roundedly as possible. And, of course, Mark brings a lot of perspectives in that regard. Former All Black, has played professionally in a number of countries around the world, was on our executive board pre-COVID when he wasn't actually working for New Zealand Rugby, so seen the kind of internal workings a little bit of World Rugby. And then, of course, chief exec of one of our leading nations in terms of New Zealand Rugby. So brings a lot of different perspectives that I think are going to be helpful for us in getting that balance and that shape right going forward.
Yeah, and certainly his experience in taking the All Blacks to the United States will be very valuable in the planning in the lead up to 2031, and we will come to that in a moment because I am very interested in that. But perhaps before we get to that, the global calendar, there was some talk that there were meetings going to be taking place, and Gush Pisho was bringing everyone together. Again, no white smoke coming out of the chimney yet. So are there decisions? What can we expect? Are we going to be playing the Rugby Championship in future years at the same time as the Six Nations? Are the players going to be able to get a rest? What news can you bring of the global calendar?
Well, no white smoke, as you said, and white smoke in the sense of the global calendar is always hard to come by. I mean, it's one of rugby's great puzzles. We did a lot of work a few years ago in this area that led to the changes that have enabled the Nations Championship and Nations Cup to sort of now in 2026 be launched, and we're really thrilled that we've got that part moving. So we've turned what were the July and November internationals into a meaningful competition that hopefully fans are excited about. That's obviously in the men's game. We'd also done a lot of work over the last couple of years to try and get a more coherent global calendar in the women's 15s game, and that the equivalent of Nations Championship there is the WXV Global Series that's slightly redefined this year. So we've got those again developing and emerging models that support global elite rugby, support men's and women's World Cups being expanded, etc. What we haven't been able to do in the men's global calendar discussion for as long as I've been involved, and again, that's more than 20 years, is get to the, I guess, full alignment where the international windows are aligned across the globe. It's challenging. It's challenging because, there are different conditions in different parts of the world, as we know well. There's different professional domestic competitions being played, and they've built their economic models around the calendar as it is. So moving one piece requires compromise in other areas, and that's the challenging debate. I think what I can say about that's really positive is there is a real alignment on, firstly, the most important thing is what alignment is needed to create a better player welfare outcome. So players at the heart of that. We know that we've got, if you're a South African player playing your domestic rugby in Europe, playing for the Springboks in their international competitions, including the Rugby Championship, that is an 11-month season that's just not sustainable at the level that the game's being played. So we've got to try and find those solutions. So there's a really good recognition of that. And then, of course, what does the fan want? And the fan wants more alignment and a more coherent global calendar. Yes. So good discussions, more work to do. We obviously want to play a role as a facilitator and a driving force from a World Rugby perspective in those discussions, as I think we have over a number of years, and just continue to bring people together. And there's a commitment to continue to look at that, which I think is really powerful.
So no announcement in 2026. Are we still years away from resolving the issue? Is it going to take, another 3, 4, 5 years?
I hope not, David, to be honest. I think that, everyone knows what the issues are, which is important. So that doesn't mean they're easy to resolve, but I think they're identified. And it's then, okay, what change is possible in what time frame? That's obviously lots of, for example, TV rights around competitions have been sold for a number of years that make it harder to move. So I think any change would be 2028 onwards, and there's a kind of recognition of that. If we could agree in 2026 what the next set of changes on that journey could look like, I think that'd be a strong outcome.
Yeah. And just on that player welfare, I mentioned it this morning in the program with Ewen McKenzie. You must have been delighted when you saw the instrumented mouthguard go off in the French player. I think it was Jelonch, the French flanker, and he was told, you're off. Now, he wasn't happy about it, but obviously the system was is working, which is great because it's keeping the players safe.
Exactly. And I think what's happened, which is fantastic over the last sort of 3 years as we've implemented these mouthguards in the professional game, is that the players and the high performance coaching staff around players are starting to recognise that, this is so important in the game, so important in player safety, ultimately in managing player load, as we would call it, and making sure players are safe. And that's becoming very individualised. What that means for one player might be different to what that means for another player, even in the same position, for example. So what we know about that is evolving all the time. We introduced that alert on the mouthguard in the Women's Rugby World Cup last year, now seeing that progress through the game. And interestingly, actually, in the Winter Olympics that just happened in Italy, in Milano Cortina, an athlete, actually a GB athlete who won the skeleton gold medal, was wearing the same instrumented mouthguards that we've introduced into rugby because he wanted the same, quality of information in his sport. So we're starting even to see other sports adopt something that was built by rugby, and we'll continue to evolve and drive that for years to come.
Now, you mentioned the women's game, and I don't think any of us could have been more delighted nor more excited about the women's Rugby World Cup in 2025 in England. It was from start to finish just a stunning success. Give me your reflections on where the women's game is at the moment in terms of World Rugby, where you're thinking about it. Obviously, WXV is going to be a great initiative this year. We're going to see more of the players in more regular competition. We're going to see the best teams playing against each other. So things are tracking pretty well, I would have thought, for the women's game. And just wondering what your views at World Rugby is and how you're thinking about the women's game.
Yeah, look, it was a wonderful 5 weeks, last August, September. I think more than anything, so thrilled for everybody involved in women's rugby, at a grassroots level, all the way through to the professional international level, because that was a moment that women's rugby absolutely deserved to be on the biggest stage it possibly could be. And a great moment in time. We knew when we awarded the tournament to be hosted in England under this sort of new delivery model that we have, that we could make that a hugely successful moment. Obviously, we knew the Red Roses were going to be very competitive, which certainly helps in terms of building excitement and audiences around the game. So we made a lot of decisions, very strategic decisions in the years building up to that I think contributed to that success. But you still got to deliver on that, and the players absolutely delivered on that. I think one of the most pleasing things, and this is where the men's game really can learn and start to evolve, is these brilliant players with their personalities shining through are absolutely the heart of that. The way they stay on the field, greet the fans afterwards, much more open across social and digital media, their engagement with the fans, because they've had to earn that share of voice, maybe in a way that others haven't. So that was absolutely, I think, at the heart of some of that success that we need to really push forward across the game as a whole. And that's not leaving the women's game anytime soon, because those personalities are very powerful. Sold out World Cup pretty much. Fantastic broadcast audiences, good commercial success, but we know there's a lot more work to do in the commercial space. What that means is there's some great lessons as we push forward. WXV Global Series, as you say, reshaped this year, the 18 best women's teams in the world, competing in that competition, and everyone looking forward at an international level to the next Women's Rugby World Cup in Australia in 2029. And again, we've been quite deliberate in decisions we made back in 2022 about saying, okay, men's and women's World Cups for the next two cycles. So Australia men's 27, women's 29, USA men's 31, women's 33 being paired, because it allows us to drive investment even harder into the women's game to make sure that we are building teams and delivery mechanisms that will keep raising the standards quickly in the delivery of Women's Rugby World Cup. So that was, again, a very deliberate set of strategic decisions to support investment and growth in the women's games. And what we're seeing, I think, which is really pleasing, is the game responding around that. So more national federations, more unions investing in their women's programs, professionalising their women's programs and trying to build the commercials. That's challenging, as it is in every sport, because you have to invest more quickly than the commercial revenues show up. That's not unique to women's rugby, but there's a real commitment around that. And what that's translating to, David, is we're seeing, more women and girls play the game. More than 30% now of people playing rugby around the world are women and girls, and that is increasing more quickly than the men's participation rates, and that's just brilliant to see. And then we want to see women in coaching roles, women in administration roles, women throughout the game.
Yeah, and indeed, I think one of the things that caught my attention from 2025, the Women's World Cup, was that the Games attracted a new fan to the sport that hadn't been there before, and a younger fan, and perhaps that engagement was what drew them to the game. So that was a big plus. But why is it that the men's game can't quite see that opportunity yet of spending more time with fans, particularly in those moments after games, where rather than giving them the wave from sort of 20 metres inside the field, that they actually go to the fence, get a selfie, and have a conversation with those people, because it's those moments that create the memories, that create the connection, that will bring people back time and time again. Why is it that? And look, it's certainly in Super Rugby, they're improving. The New South Wales Waratahs are doing it well. The Brumbies are doing it well. I saw a Bulls game in South Africa the other week where they brought the fans onto the field. So it's happening, but I'm just surprised that it's not happening faster.
You're right, it is happening. It definitely is happening. And we've got this younger generation, obviously, of young male players coming through that are, social media stars and want to be, and again, building their own brand. I think there's a whole, it's a complex area for rugby, I think for a couple of reasons, if I oversimplify it. One is that we've always had this wonderful ethos in rugby that is team first. And so players don't put themselves kind of ahead of the team. And that's brilliant. But it's also a bit of a barrier to creating stars at an individual level that other sports have, that maybe rugby's held itself a little bit back from. And I think what compounded that as the game has professionalised over the last 30 years or so is that, we're in a very complex physical sport. And so from a high performance perspective, the high performance managers, the coaching staff are absolutely saying to the players, these are the things you need to focus on to be the best rugby player and the best athlete you can be. And that's not thinking about what's going to engage fans and, as you say, taking selfies. And, actually it's get off the field and get in the ice bath as quickly as possible. Don't stay on the field and take the selfie. So it's how we find those balances again in rugby. But we've got some brilliant young stars. I mean, in Australia, I think, it's fascinating the era that we're coming into in Australian rugby, because what you've seen, I think, in the women's sevens team, for example, where they're been absolute rock stars for the last 10 years since Rio 2016 and that gold medal, is being seen now by the players in the Wallaroos squad, in some of whom are the same, of course, and in the Wallabies squad, where again you've got young players with a very different attitude to individual fan engagement, which is what we need. We need a lot of Alona Myers who are going to build their own brands, be bold about it and brash about it, and put rugby on a stage it might not otherwise be on.
Yeah, and that high performance angle, I think it's a fair point that you raised, because certainly I observed that through the many years that I was involved with professional teams. But again, that curmudgeon Eddie Jones even believes and agrees that it's possible that 20-minute period after the game should belong to the fans, and really for the performance benefit, it's marginal. So I think we just really need to continue to do whatever we can to keep and encourage those moments of connection, because that is where the growth is going to come from. And that's where we're going to attract younger fans. So what's the data telling you at World Rugby at the moment about how successful we are in attracting the affection of younger fans? Are we doing a good enough job, or do we need to do much, much more?
I think we're progressing, and that's great, but we've got to progress more quickly. I mean, to our earlier point, sometimes rugby moves a bit more slowly than other sports and other, our competitors in terms of sports and entertainment. So we've got to keep, and we say this a lot at the moment, we've got to keep putting the fan at the centre of decision making, and particularly to your point, David, the younger fan. So we've got a great avid fan base in lots of places around the world where rugby is a relatively established sport, but they tend to be slightly older fans. And again, they tend to be people that have grown up with the sport, or with a family that's grown up with the sport. We've got to try and make sure we are doing a good enough job, or a better job, at attracting new fans. Women's Rugby World Cup last year, as you've already mentioned, did a great job of that. So about 50% of the people who went and bought tickets for that event had never been to a rugby game before, and the vast majority, 90% plus of those, confirmed in sort of survey results they'd love to go back. So again, are we giving them enough opportunity to do that? And that's, again, I think, again, it's very simplistic, isn't it? But you compare yourselves to other sports and you say, when you arrive at the stadium for a rugby game, whether it's Super Rugby Pacific, it's Gallagher Prem Rugby here in the UK, it's URC, it's Rugby World Cup, is the fan experience good enough? Is what you're being offered at the stadium good enough? And then the game itself, when you're in your seat, is it being presented to you in a really compelling way? Sometimes yes, but we got more to do, I think, in some areas on that. And then when you're at home consuming rugby through either traditional television or other forms of media, again, are we making this a really compelling, entertaining product, or are fans drifting off and doing other things because actually it's a bit complicated and I don't really understand it? And we know from surveying younger fans, if they find it confusing, then they find it boring. And if they find it boring, they go and do something else. So we've got to try and just continue. And every sport is in this, in this challenging space. We've got to keep investing time and thought in that process.
Now, I'm sure you'd agree with me that, obviously the sport has enormous potential, and it's men's game, women's game, the youth game, at the under-20 level, across the various continents, whether it be Africa or through Asia. But there's simply not enough money at the moment to go around to really realise this wonderful global potential. And I'm sure you'd agree with me about that, because, I'm sure as the CEO, you'd love to be investing everywhere because there is worthy causes and worthy investment that could be made. Now, the current business model for World Rugby is also a little challenging, given that you raise 95% of your revenue 6 weeks every 4 years. And for the major unions, they raise about the same on 8 to 10 days in every given year. So what's the answer? How do we generate more revenue into the game such that the investments can be made to help realise that potential?
Yeah, look, great. It's the enduring rugby, along with probably officiating and shape of the game. It's the enduring rugby question, I think, certainly in the 20 odd years that I've been involved, David. The answer is more fans. I mean, the answer is absolutely
more fans.
The game needs to have more fans who are consuming more rugby more of the time, because then our media partners and broadcasters are going to pay us higher fees. Our partners and sponsors are going to pay us higher fees, and we're going to generate higher revenues from, ticketing and other match day revenues. So, as you say, rugby's interesting. Compare ourselves to our peers, even in international sports. So if we compare ourselves to football or soccer, and we compare ourselves to basketball, two sports that are like us, are quite global in nature, but maybe concentrated in certain markets. They have a massive global fan base that we don't have. I mean, compare ourselves even to cricket, which probably has less countries playing the game than rugby, but of course has India and other nations. I mean, cricket T20 ICC World Cup final last week, watched by 1 billion people in India. We don't have that in rugby at the moment to commercialise. And by dint of history, rugby is a very mature sport in a relatively small number of countries, and those countries are relatively small populations. So that presents part of that challenge for us as a sport, and the answer needs to be making sure that we continue to nurture fandom in those established markets. We definitely shouldn't be complacent about that. And again, whether it's Six Nations or the Super Rugby Pacific at the moment, or the Rugby Championship later in the year, we've got to make sure that the product is the best it can be. But then the really big moments like men's and women's Rugby World Cups, making sure that we are really driving those iconic events on a global level. And that's why, and it's not at the expense of any other nation. That's why USA has been such a kind of North Star for us. And we've worked over the last 10 years, to be honest, at how do we build rugby's audiences and rugby's ultimately commercials and participation in the US, and placing Rugby World Cups there in 2031 and 2033, which we did back in 2022, so with a long horizon, was absolutely part of that sort of North Star approach. And now we're working really hard in the background, a lot of unseen work to put the foundations in place for those World Cups to be really successful. And if they are, they will drive significant economics into the global game, not just one-off moments for 6 weeks in those 2 years, but actually for the long term. And then we've got to be deliberate about how we do that. And we saw some of that with Japan 2019. I took this current role in World Rugby, or joined World Rugby in early 2014. Everyone said, you're never going to do the World Cup in Japan. You'll end up moving that. They won't be ready. A lot of the same things we hear about America, incidentally. And we showed that actually, a massive iconic World Cup can drive rugby audiences. Japan's had a long history of great rugby being played, and it's a great university sport and so on, and a professional league. We believe that the US can harness that opportunity in a slightly different way.
Yeah. But it's interesting, though, isn't it? Because, and I know Six Nations is not your responsibility, but the other week I sort of read through on the program all of the countries and all of the different carriers where the game was being broadcast. And really, it covers the world. But what we don't seem to be able to get is a weekly number, say from the weekend, that says X number watched the games at the weekend, and I'm sure that if you tallied them all up, it would be enormous. Why is it that we can't aggregate those figures and publish those figures so people can see that rugby is actually a very, very large and important game? Because who knows how many people watch those matches at the weekend?
Yeah, it's a great point, David, and something we should continue to have our eyes on, because I mean the underlying challenge to that is that we have all these different competition owners in rugby, and we sell our rights in a very fragmented way, and that's actually not very smart on a whole range of levels, because rugby doesn't have enough scale, isn't again a big enough sport in enough places to have that level of fragmentation. But it's very historical. You know, we almost compete within the game sometimes, which is making what we've already got in terms of challenges even more challenging. And that's one of the byproducts of it, because we've all got different broadcast partners in different parts of the world. So bringing those numbers together, certainly quickly, you could probably do it on a semi-regular basis and certainly on an annual basis, but getting those numbers quickly, which would be a great story, exactly as you said.
Yeah, that's right. Feeds the media cycle that, you know, if there was a number of like 100 million watch the Six Nations at the weekend, which I'm quite sure it probably was that, if not more. We're coming up to time, and I want to be respectful because you have a very big job. But just a couple of things before we go. 2027 Rugby World Cup in Australia. The first run at tickets is done. We've got 750,000 from 134 countries. That put a smile on your face?
It does. It does put a smile on our faces. A lot of hard work, as you can imagine, has gone into that. Fantastic start. You know, the first pre-sale, 750,000 tickets sold, which is, you know, for example, you know, that's more than the Lions tour, which was hugely successful last year. But we've got 2.5 million tickets to sell, and we want to sell them all. So, and we've got a great track record in men's Rugby World Cups of sort of 98, 99% sell through for every game. So there's a long way to go, but it shows this fantastic interest, and there's fantastic interest internationally, and more than half of those tickets were sold in Australia. So we know there's great interest in Australia for Rugby World Cup. So we're really excited about the next ticket phase in May. And then going and pushing on from there, and trying to make sure that not just for the big games and the final and the recognisable teams, that for all the games, whether you're in Townsville or Newcastle or Adelaide, that everyone's excited in their local community. So yeah, great start, but long way to go.
And I imagine that 29, the Women's Rugby World Cup in Australia, will also attract a great deal of interest, and I'm convinced about that. But then, obviously, the big dance, the big move into 2031 into the United States. You know, seen by some as risky, seen by me as absolutely necessary, needed to do it. You've got to unlock the biggest commercial market in the world. We have to do something about it. There is going to be a plan that's going to be revealed about just exactly what is happening in 2031. So give us the Soldiers 5 about 2031 and moving into North America.
Yeah, look, it's exciting. I mean, we've been excited about it from day one. And so I've personally been working on sort of Plan USA for more than 10 years. So it's a long road in. But there, just like that conversation about Japan previously, there is a lot of rugby consumed and played in America at youth and high school level, at college level, in club level. It's just not well publicized and well known. There are some big dominant sporting beasts, obviously, in the American market, but and not only is there a lot of rugby played and consumed in America, there are a lot of people from all of rugby's key rugby playing nations living in America. So deliberately taking international content to America year on year for World Rugby being part of those discussions is really important. You mentioned Mark Robinson earlier on. Mark's obviously been a big part of that. New Zealand and Ireland have been the sort of driving force behind some of that. So we're working across a range of national unions to make sure not just USA Rugby are playing men's and women's matches in America, and they're playing more and more each year and better, but that we are taking some big marquee moments there and building audiences. And we've got one of those later this year with the greatest rivalry in New Zealand and South Africa playing in Baltimore Ravens NFL Stadium in September. And that, again, you'll see us build on that year on year in both the men's and women's game. That's all about the proof points and building audiences towards 2031. And we've got great interest. We've got, I think, 27 cities and venues in a discussion with us, range of different city and venue types. We're obviously looking with real interest at FIFA World Cup that's just around the corner now, less than 100 days until that competition, and talking to our colleagues there. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and ultimately coming back to that question of rugby's economics. If rugby can command 1% of the existing sports rights market in the US, which is more than half of the world's sports rights market, then rugby would double its global economy, which is a crazy statistic. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy to get even that 1%, but that's the size of the prize in terms of what we're trying to do here for the sort of future of the game.
Okay, 2 more questions. What are the 3 things that are keeping you up at night?
Pleasingly, not too much. I sleep pretty well. I sleep pretty well. Look, we've talked about them all, David. I mean, we know what are the 3 things that are a constant. Making sure that we're doing the best we can with the game, and constantly thinking about how do we keep attracting more and more fans to our great sport, because I think we've got the greatest team sport in the world, with some really unique values and some really unique characteristics, and so we think about that all the time, and that is at the heart of it. Related to that, the second thing is player safety and welfare. It's great to have that fantastic physical sport, but we've got to do our best to make sure it's as safe as possible at every level, community and elite, for players to play. And then finally, that piece around commercialisation. The sport's going to grow more and more quickly if we can collectively invest more in it, and we've got to drive, therefore, the commercialisation of the sport really hard, because all of our competitors are doing that with their sports and their products. So those are the 3 things that I think are kind of constant every day at some point in what we do.
Yeah. Now, final question. It's a message that I often give to the third voice, as we call them here, the audience for Rugby Unity, and it's this. The point of agency is that, World Rugby and the national unions can do what they can do, but unless people who follow the game, love the game, do something, nothing's ever going to happen. The game belongs to the people, and they actually have to do something, and that's a regular theme that we return to. But what message would you have, for our audience? We have lots and lots and lots of listeners now, hundreds of thousands of people every week coming to listen to Rugby Unity from 135 countries, which is great. So what simple message would you like to give to the audience about their role in helping to secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world?
Yeah, great question. Well, look, first of all, to thank them for being rugby fans and for being engaged with the sport and being engaged in a brilliant debate that you and Rugby Unity drive, David. So thank you for that as well. I think the message, I always give to rugby fans, including Saturday, stood in the pub watching Six Nations matches, is, let's be, as we all are, really passionate about the sport, but let's be really positive about it. We've got a wonderful sport, again, that's got so many unique characteristics and values. Let's be advocates for that. What I always say to people is, who don't know rugby, is spend some time with it. Watch some rugby. Again, watch some of the brilliant athletes, the brilliant moments we have in our sport. So the more positive we are as advocates, I think, as existing with a family, we want to bring more people in. We want to sort of drag more people into what we're loving and experiencing. So yeah, be positive advocates, I think, is the message.
It's interesting you raised that, because one of our correspondents sent a note to me just saying, be more positive. You guys, you're ganging up on the game too much. And it only comes from a good place that, that we all want the great thing. And after last weekend, I'm captain positive, Not even Eddie Jones can make me cranky at the moment, And I'm sure he as well. I spoke to him before he headed to Sri Lanka, and we were just remarking of just what a superb weekend that we have just all enjoyed, and it does just demonstrate how good a game rugby is, this values-based global sport, and just to see the quality of the game, and again, you mentioned it before, but to see the athletes, the way they're prepared, the tactical way that they're playing, it's just such a wonderful game, and it's getting better and better and better. So yeah, I think we just need to all, come together, be positive, work hard, keep talking about it, and keep nudging people to say, hey, get involved in the game, have a look at it, and be part of what is a very welcoming global community. So for your experience as you grew up through the game around Gloucester, my experience growing up here in the game is exactly the same in Australia, and we've all had that wonderful unity and engagement through the game, which has given us all so much, which makes us as passionate as we are about our wonderful sport, where there is so much to look forward to. And we won't talk about it because I know you've got lots of things to do, but the Nations Championship and the Nations Cup and the World XV this year, I think they are going to be outstanding. I think those competitions are going to change the way that we think about rugby. It just gets me jazzed thinking about it, all leading to that wonderful final weekend in November, 3 doubleheaders in a row in Twickenham. You won't be able to abseil into the joint. They'll be absolutely packed, 3 days in a row in London. So much to look forward to. So anyway, Alan, thank you so much for being generous with your time and to share it with the audience. I know you are a very, very busy man and very grateful for that. And we'll get you back on the program along the way as we have more things to talk about. Perhaps when we launch that program, that strategic plan in May, we might get you to come back and walk us through it line by line and really explain it to people, because they are hungry for more information. And I know that from the engagement that we have with people here at Rugby Unity. So the more comms out of World Rugby, the better. And getting you back to explain the strategic plan would be a great thing. So, Alan, thank you so much for your time today. And thanks to you, the audience. What a great conversation. A true rugby man, working hard, day in, day out, being careful, being thoughtful, being deliberate about how do we grow the game. And I think in the discussions that we've had with Alan Gilpin today and previously with Brett Robinson, as chairman of World Rugby, you can see there's great alignment between the board and the executive, which is a great thing. So, again, a very big thanks to Alan Gilpin for joining us today, and a big thanks for you for coming back once again. And as I say, the growth of the program, the audience is fantastic. If you do see our content, please, a like, a share, a nudge, a comment, anything like that. Or indeed, if you've got time for a rating or a review, it does help the program to be found, and I would be very grateful if you did that. So, once again, a big thanks to Alan Gilpin, and please, people, be kind to each other. My name is David Pembroke, and it's bye for now.